Hey there, fellow Potterheads. Get ready to dive deep into a fascinating character within the Harry Potter world. Today, we're chatting about Severus Snape. Severus Snape, probably one of the most complex and intriguing characters in the entire Harry Potter series. He's the guy you love to hate, or maybe just hate to love, depending on your perspective. So let's take a look at the fascinating, often misunderstood world of Snape, and why he's so much more than just the greasy-haired, brooding professor we first meet. Before we look into some interesting theories about him, let's get to know him a little better. Severus Snape wasn't always the cold, calculating, sarcastic figure we know and love to loathe. He was born to Tobias Snape, a bitter, abusive muggle, and Eileen Prince, a witch from a prominent magical family. Growing up in a home filled with neglect and resentment, it's no surprise that Snape's early life was a far cry from happy. His experiences at home shaped much of his darker nature. The constant emotional abuse and sense of isolation left him vulnerable to the influence of darker forces. In his Hogwarts years, Snape was a brilliant student, probably one of the most gifted witches and wizards of his time. But rather than embracing the light side of magic, Snape quickly found himself seduced by the dark arts. He joined Lord Voldemort's Death Eaters as a young, impressionable teenager, eager for power and a sense of belonging, something he'd always lacked at home. This decision would haunt him for the rest of his life, but it wasn't the end of his story. It wasn't all darkness for Snape. In fact, one of the driving forces in his life, and something that would shape his actions more than anything, was his love for Lily Potter, Harry's mother. Lily and Snape had been childhood friends, but their paths diverged when Lily chose James Potter, the charismatic and popular Gryffindor, over Snape, who had already begun to gravitate toward darker magic. When Snape heard that Lily was in danger from Voldemort, who had marked Harry for death, he desperately tried to warn her, but it was too late. Lily and James were murdered, and Harry survived the killing curse. Snape's love for Lily, and the devastation of her death, became his greatest regret, and fueled much of his later actions. From that moment on, Snape vowed to protect Harry, though he did so in the most complicated and often painful way possible. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Snape's true loyalties were never as clear-cut as they seemed. While he continued to serve Voldemort, he was secretly working for Dumbledore, who had known all along about Snape's inner torment and secret love for Lily. Snape had become a double agent, playing a dangerous game of deception, but always with the goal of protecting Harry, however much he resented the boy. By the time we meet Snape in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, he's the potions master at Hogwarts, a role he's excelled at thanks to his natural talent. But he's also the head of Slytherin, making him a constant antagonist for Harry and his friends. To make things worse, Snape seems to have a deep, almost personal hatred for Harry, something Harry can't quite understand. The reason behind this animosity is both simple and heartbreaking. Harry looks too much like his father, James Potter, the man Snape despised more than anyone. The younger Snape's deep insecurities and jealousy about James's popularity and bravery had carried over into his hatred for Harry, whose resemblance to his father was like an emotional punch every time Snape looked at him. Despite this, there were hints that Snape was not purely evil. His actions were often contradictory, and his behavior, though abrasive and cruel, was not devoid of moral complexity. He would do terrible things, but there was always the suggestion that Snape was operating under a deeper, hidden sense of duty, especially when it came to keeping Harry alive. Now, here's where it all starts to make sense. After Voldemort's return and the Dark Wizard's rise to power, Snape's true loyalty to Dumbledore's side becomes increasingly clear. Even after the shocking murder of Dumbledore by Snape himself in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, we're left in the dark about Snape's true motivations. Was Snape loyal to Voldemort, or was he still working for the good guys? In the final book, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, this is where all the pieces come together. Snape's ultimate sacrifice and the truth about his double life are revealed through his final acts. His unwavering loyalty to Dumbledore and the depth of his love for Lily Potter become the keys to understanding everything Snape did. The big reveal in the Pensieve, when Harry learns about Snape's Patronus and the heartbreaking truth about his feelings for Lily, is a turning point, showing Snape's true nature as a man driven by love, guilt, and a sense of responsibility for the boy he once resented. Snape wasn't just a cold, bitter man. He was a tragic hero, a man who spent his life fighting for redemption, even though it meant living in constant pain and hiding his true feelings. In the end, Snape's final words to Harry, "Look at me," are a plea to be understood, to have his life, full of sacrifice and complexity, finally recognized. Snape is complicated. He's a man whose life was filled with regret, betrayal, love, and sacrifice. He was a double agent, working for the greater good while walking a razor-thin line between the light and the dark. His motivations, though hidden behind a mask of arrogance and cruelty, were deeply tied to his past. Snape's journey is one of redemption, but it's a redemption he never fully embraces, because, in his mind, he doesn't deserve it. That's what makes him so fascinating. He's a person who deserves a second chance, but doesn't think he can ever truly earn it. So, while Snape might have seemed like just a villain for most of the series, he's really a tragic hero in disguise. Someone who, in the end, gave up everything for the safety of others, even if it meant living in misery and self-loathing. His story is one of love, loyalty, and ultimate sacrifice, which makes him one of the most memorable and misunderstood characters in all of Harry Potter. Now we understand him a little better. Let's look into some interesting theories about him. Severus Snape's ability to fool Voldemort is one of the most intriguing aspects of his character. On the surface, it seems almost impossible. How could a man who had once been a loyal Death Eater manage to deceive the most powerful dark wizard of all time? But what if there's more to Snape's success than just cunning and bravery? Well, here's an intriguing theory. What if the key to Snape's deception wasn't just his acting ability or the loyalty he feigned, but his very identity as a half-blood wizard? Throughout the series, Snape's heritage as a half-blood is often a point of shame for him, something that, unlike others in his position, he doesn't flaunt. But what if this very fact gave him an advantage over other Death Eaters when it came to deceiving Voldemort? Well, here's the theory. Snape, being a half-blood, was uniquely positioned to understand Voldemort's weaknesses, not just as a man, but as a wizard, driven by a profound obsession with blood purity. Voldemort, who believed that Muggleborns were inferior, would never fully trust a half-blood, not even one as brilliant and talented as Snape. So Snape, with his half-blood status, was able to use Voldemort's own prejudice against him to his advantage. Think about it. Voldemort's arrogance meant he viewed Snape as inferior, and therefore not a threat. He likely underestimated him, believing that Snape, despite being one of his most trusted Death Eaters, was still somehow beneath him because of his mixed heritage. This allowed Snape to operate in a way that most people would have found impossible. He could walk the line between the Death Eaters and Dumbledore's side without raising suspicion. Voldemort's arrogance and deep-seated hatred for half-bloods worked against him, leaving him blind to Snape's true loyalty. But there's more. Voldemort was obsessed with control. He wanted to know everything, be everywhere, and possess all knowledge. But he never took the time to truly understand Snape's emotional complexity. The Dark Lord prided himself on seeing through people, but in Snape, he missed something crucial. Snape's deep, unyielding love for Lily Potter, which was so pure and genuine that it acted as a kind of magical shield against Voldemort's mental intrusions. You see, Voldemort was a master at reading people's minds, using legitimacy to extract information and control those around him. But Snape's emotions, specifically his love for Lily, were so raw, so deep, that they acted as a mental barricade Voldemort couldn't breach. This wasn't just any love. It was a potent, self-sacrificial love that tied Snape to Dumbledore and Harry in ways Voldemort would never have understood. Because Snape's love wasn't about power or self-interest. It was about protecting a life that had already been lost. It was this emotional complexity that Voldemort simply couldn't fathom. As a result, Snape's inner world remained off-limits to Voldemort's powers. Even though Voldemort thought he had complete control over his followers, Voldemort may have been able to see Snape's actions, hear his words, and even sense his outward loyalties. But the true depth of Snape's motivations, especially his love for Lily and his ultimate commitment to protecting Harry, remained a mystery, even to the Dark Lord himself. It's almost like Snape had a kind of magical invisibility when it came to Voldemort's scrutiny. And this invisibility wasn't due to some complex charm or spell. It was because Voldemort was too blinded by his own pride and prejudices to ever see Snape as a true threat. In short, Snape's success in fooling Voldemort could have been rooted in the very thing that Voldemort despised, his half-blood status. By embracing the power of his mixed heritage, not just as a product of two worlds, but as someone who could see beyond the narrow mindset of blood purity, Snape was able to outmaneuver the Dark Lord. Voldemort's hatred for half-bloods made him blind to the one thing that Snape had, the ability to truly understand the hearts of both the Death Eaters and the Light, making Snape the perfect double agent. It was Snape's vulnerability and emotional depth, things Voldemort could neither comprehend nor control, that made him dangerous in the best possible way. Voldemort's obsession with purity and power may have made him a master at reading actions and spells, but it was Snape's capacity for love, sacrifice, and self-doubt that allowed him to play the long game against the Dark Lord's twisted vision. So, in a sense, Snape was able to fool Voldemort because Voldemort didn't understand the one thing that made him truly powerful: his heart and his ability to shield it from Voldemort's prying eyes. Here's an intriguing theory about Severus Snape's intense hatred for Harry Potter, and it revolves around the concept of horcruxes. Specifically, the idea that Harry himself was a living horcrux, which may have unknowingly intensified Snape's animosity. We all know that Snape despised Harry, especially in the early books. He seemed to harbor an irrational hatred for the boy, even though Harry had never done anything to personally offend him. Snape's disdain for Harry was often chalked up to his unresolved feelings about Harry's father, James Potter. But what if there was more to it? What if Harry's very existence as a horcrux made Snape's hatred even deeper than just the normal resentment between Slytherin and Gryffindor? Here's the theory. Harry, as a living horcrux, was an embodiment of everything Snape feared and despised. The reason Snape couldn't tolerate Harry wasn't just because Harry looked like James Potter or because of the bitter history between him and Lily. It was because Harry was, in a way, carrying the dark soul fragment of Voldemort inside him, a piece of the very dark magic that Snape had once willingly embraced. Think about it. Snape, in his youth, was deeply entangled in Voldemort's world. He'd made the ultimate sacrifice, turning his back on the Dark Lord and aligning himself with Dumbledore. But that didn't mean Snape had fully escaped his dark past. Snape had seen the horrors of Voldemort's power up close, and he knew better than anyone the corruption and destruction that a piece of Voldemort's soul could wreak. He had seen Voldemort create horcruxes, had seen how those pieces of soul made their creator more monstrous, and Snape himself was haunted by the memories of his own service to that evil cause. Now, imagine Snape seeing Harry, who he already disliked for looking like James, for acting like an arrogant Gryffindor, and for constantly getting in his way, only to realize that Harry was, in a very real sense, a part of Voldemort, a horcrux, carrying the dark soul fragment of the very man Snape had tried to destroy and redeem himself from. This would be particularly unbearable for Snape. Every time he looked at Harry, it wasn't just James he saw. It was a living, breathing embodiment of the evil he had once served. Harry was a walking reminder of the terrible choices Snape had made in his past. The boy wasn't just a Potter, he was a reminder of Voldemort's existence, the very dark force Snape had spent years trying to fight against. Snape's personal guilt over his time as a Death Eater, his past decisions, his role in Lily's death, the harm he caused, would have manifested in his hatred for Harry as a symbolic representation of everything he had once been. Now let's take this further. It's important to remember that the presence of a horcrux doesn't just cause external conflict, it also causes internal strife. A horcrux isn't just a magical object, it's a piece of a soul. When a person creates a horcrux, they essentially split their soul and hide a part of it in another object or person to avoid death. This is why Voldemort in particular became increasingly inhuman as he created more horcruxes. With every piece of his soul he ripped away, he lost part of his humanity. So what if Snape, even subconsciously, could sense the taint of Voldemort's soul within Harry? Snape had spent so many years immersed in the darkness of the Dark Lord that it's possible he could feel that dark presence in Harry, a fragment of Voldemort's essence slowly gnawing at Harry's soul. We know that Snape was a highly skilled legilimens, able to read minds, and while there's no direct evidence that he could specifically detect the horcrux within Harry, Snape was deeply intuitive when it came to magic. Perhaps, in some way, Snape sensed that Harry wasn't fully Harry. He was carrying a piece of Voldemort, and it was like a magical poison. The presence of Voldemort's soul fragment would have been like an emotional trigger for Snape, throwing him back into the very darkness he was desperate to escape. Every time Harry crossed Snape's path, it wasn't just Harry's brash attitude or his father's shadow that triggered Snape. It was the unseen, magical bond between them, a connection that linked them through Voldemort's lingering presence inside Harry. This dark aura would make Snape's reactions to Harry more visceral, almost like an emotional compulsion, as if he was confronting a version of himself from his worst moments. In the end, Snape's hatred for Harry may have been intertwined with his own self-loathing. Snape hated the part of Voldemort's soul inside Harry because it was a constant reminder of his own guilt, shame, and association with Voldemort's evil. But, paradoxically, this also explains the protective streak Snape had for Harry. The boy, in a twisted way, represented Snape's chance for redemption, a way for Snape to right the wrongs he had committed as a Death Eater by helping Harry defeat Voldemort once and for all. In Snape's mind, Harry wasn't just Lily's son. He was also a living connection to the dark magic that Snape had tried to leave behind. Harry was the last person Snape wanted to protect, but at the same time, he was also the only person who could ultimately destroy Voldemort's soul, and thereby sever the connection that haunted Snape so deeply. By ensuring Harry's survival, Snape was, in a sense, ensuring that the horcrux within Harry could be destroyed, along with the Dark Lord's reign of terror. So what does this all mean? Snape's hatred for Harry could have been more than just a reflection of his past rivalry with James. It could have been rooted in the dark magic of the horcrux, the piece of Voldemort's soul inside Harry that caused Snape to feel a combination of disgust, guilt, and fear. Harry wasn't just a mirror of everything Snape hated about his past. He was also a living embodiment of the evil Snape had once served. And that connection was something Snape couldn't easily reconcile, no matter how much he secretly protected the boy. It's a chilling thought, but it makes Snape's relationship with Harry even more tragic. Snape's complex feelings toward Harry were driven not only by love and hate, but also by the dark magic that tied their fates together. A reminder that even in his deepest efforts to redeem himself, Snape could never fully escape the shadow of Voldemort. What do you think? Let me know in the comments section. Okay, moving on. Nextly, let's take a look at the relationship between Severus Snape and Albus Dumbledore, which is one of the most fascinating and complex dynamics in the Harry Potter series. On the surface, Snape seems like the one who is constantly in control of his own fate, but what if Dumbledore, in a more subtle and manipulative way, had a much greater influence over Snape than we ever realized? What if Dumbledore's control over Snape wasn't just about Snape's role as a double agent or his loyalty to the Order of the Phoenix, but about something deeper, something more psychological? Here's an interesting theory. Dumbledore's control over Snape was not just political or magical. It was deeply emotional and psychological. Dumbledore, through his profound understanding of human nature, had a way of getting inside Snape's mind and playing on his insecurities, his guilt, and his need for redemption. At the heart of this theory is the idea that Dumbledore understood Snape's emotional vulnerabilities better than anyone else. Dumbledore knew exactly how to manipulate those vulnerabilities to ensure that Snape would continue to follow his path, no matter how difficult or dangerous it became. And part of that control came from Dumbledore's ability to exploit Snape's guilt, especially surrounding Lily Potter's death. When Snape first approached Dumbledore for help, it was because of his remorse for his role in passing the prophecy to Voldemort, which indirectly led to Lily's death. This guilt was unbearable for Snape, and Dumbledore knew that he could use it to control him by offering Snape a chance to atone for his actions, by becoming a double agent, by protecting Harry Potter. Dumbledore effectively tied Snape's redemption to his loyalty to Dumbledore. Snape had no other way out. He couldn't escape the consequences of his actions with Voldemort, and the only way to redeem himself was to work for Dumbledore. This became an emotional prison for Snape. In a sense, Dumbledore's control over Snape wasn't just about loyalty to the greater good. It was about Snape's desperate need to atone for his past, and Dumbledore used that need as a form of leverage. Another key part of this theory is that Dumbledore's influence over Snape was not just through orders or promises of redemption. It was through the quiet, almost unspoken trust that Dumbledore extended to Snape. Dumbledore was the only person who ever truly believed in Snape, and Snape craved that belief more than anything. Let's be honest. Snape was never going to be a model hero or a typical member of the Order of the Phoenix. His methods, his harshness, and his ability to bend the rules made him an unpredictable ally. Yet Dumbledore always trusted Snape's loyalty, even when others, like Harry and Sirius, doubted him. This faith that Dumbledore had in Snape was incredibly powerful because it gave Snape a sense of purpose and a belief in himself that he had never experienced before. In a way, Dumbledore's trust gave Snape a reason to fight against the darkness that threatened to consume him. But the psychological catch was that Snape's desire to keep that trust and prove himself to Dumbledore made him vulnerable to Dumbledore's subtle manipulation. Dumbledore, recognizing Snape's need for approval, could guide Snape's actions in a way that Snape would accept as his own choices, even if, in reality, Dumbledore was orchestrating much of it from behind the scenes. It's almost as if Dumbledore turned Snape into a pawn in the battle against Voldemort, not through direct force or control, but by making Snape believe he was making the choices of his own free will. Dumbledore's trust, while genuine, was also a form of psychological leverage. There's also a possibility that Dumbledore understood Snape's ambition for power, his desire to be more than a mere pawn, and used that understanding to guide him. Snape, after all, was not just a scared, remorseful man. He was also a highly intelligent, driven wizard, hungry for recognition and control. Dumbledore was fully aware that Snape's ambition had once driven him to Voldemort's side, and that the key to keeping Snape on his side was to offer him power and agency in their fight against the Dark Lord. This was evident when Snape was entrusted with more and more responsibilities within the Order, and, eventually, with the secret task of protecting Harry. By positioning Snape in a place of seeming power, as the Potions Master, as the head of Slytherin House, and as Dumbledore's trusted ally, Dumbledore kept Snape invested in the fight. Snape, deep down, wanted to prove that he was in control of his own destiny. And Dumbledore, understanding this, allowed Snape to feel that he had more autonomy than he truly did. But in reality, Dumbledore's long-term plans for Snape were manipulative, shaping Snape into the ultimate instrument of his defeat of Voldemort. In this way, Snape's ambition for power was not ignored, but carefully co-opted into Dumbledore's broader strategy. By giving Snape some semblance of control, Dumbledore was able to steer him along the path to the final, inevitable betrayal: Snape's promise to protect Harry at all costs. The ultimate test of Dumbledore's control over Snape comes when Dumbledore asks Snape to kill him. This moment is often viewed as a self-sacrificial act for the greater good, but what if it's also the ultimate example of Dumbledore's psychological control over Snape? At this point in the series, Snape has already made countless sacrifices for the cause. He's already been emotionally tortured by his past mistakes, has already lost his closest friend, Lily, and has been working against Voldemort for years. But when Dumbledore asks him to end his life, he's asking Snape to make the ultimate sacrifice for the Order. Not just his life, but his identity. This is a monumental test of Snape's loyalty, and a final act of control by Dumbledore. Snape is forced to follow through with this decision, knowing that it will lead to his ultimate death, and perhaps even to a reputation as a traitor. Yet, at the same time, Snape's entire life has been shaped by Dumbledore's manipulation. His need for redemption, his desire to protect Harry, and his internal conflict between guilt and ambition all lead him to fulfill Dumbledore's request. This isn't just a moment of self-sacrifice, it's a powerful moment of psychological dominance. Dumbledore, knowing how deeply Snape felt about Lily's death and how committed he was to protecting Harry, manipulated Snape into being his ultimate weapon, not just to fight Voldemort, but to bring Voldemort's reign to an end by becoming the instrument of his own death. In the end, Dumbledore used Snape's love for Lily, his guilt, and his desire for redemption as the tools that would lead to his downfall. Dumbledore's control over Snape wasn't just magical or tactical. It was emotional and psychological. Dumbledore understood Snape's weaknesses, his fears, and his desires better than anyone, and he used that knowledge to guide Snape's every action. By playing on Snape's guilt, his need for redemption, and his latent ambition, Dumbledore was able to keep Snape tethered to his greater plan, even if Snape didn't fully realize the depth of his manipulation. Snape was never fully in control of his fate, even when it seemed that way. Dumbledore, in his infinite wisdom, and sometimes cold pragmatism, had him playing the role of the perfect double agent, not just for Voldemort, but for the future of the wizarding world. Well, that's it for today. But don't worry, next time we'll be diving into more characters and artifacts that could reveal even more secrets hidden in the Harry Potter universe. So stay tuned, and keep your eyes peeled for the hidden things lurking just below the surface. You never know what you might find.